Aloha, welcome to Hope Chat from Makiki. I'm Pastor Corey, and today I'm going to talk with you about what you can take with you to heaven. You know, my mother was telling me the other day about how she sometimes felt bad that we grew up so poor, and about how she had to work so much because my father was often unable to hold a steady job because of his health. But I can also remember growing up with the knowledge that even if I had been born into a rich family, when I died, I couldn't take it with me anyway. Of course, to a young boy, the thought that there were things that you would not be able to take with you when you died didn't matter all that much. But probably because my own father passed away at the relatively young age of 55. As I've watched my children grow, and as I approach, yes, and have now passed the age of 50, I've wondered if there really wasn't anything I'd be able to take with me to heaven when my time here on earth was done. How about you? Have you ever thought of such things? If not, maybe you're too young to consider such things, or maybe you haven't really given much thought to what happens when you die. In either case, I want to challenge you to consider that there are some things you can take with you into eternity. Your relationship with Christ, of course, and your relationships with other believers. Just as our souls are eternal, so our friendships too can be held for all eternity. Why do I believe this about relationships? Well, because the importance that Paul himself learned to place upon relationships. Relationships that were once broken, relationships across socio-economic lines, relationships across lines of culture, ethnicity, even gender. While such friendships today might be rare, in Paul's times they were rarer still. And yet we find that in this vital channel of communication, written while a prisoner of Rome, Paul makes it clear that relationships in Christ with those who've become born of the same womb of God, a good understanding of the word koinonia, which we translate fellowship today, and consider to be more of an activity than a kind of relationship, well, these people are to be treasured in this life because they will be with us in the next. In Colossians 4 verses 7 through 9, we find Paul beginning by mentioning some friends that he had in common with the Colossian believers. He begins by introducing his messenger, Tychicus, probably someone of good social standing, for his name means fortuitous or fortunate. In the same breath, though, with a former runaway slave who we learn more about in Paul's letter to Philemon, Onesimus. Philemon was Onesimus' Colossian master. Notice that in Christ, the socio-economic, the political status of this world does not transfer to the next. A good lesson to be remembered when we meet with the rich and powerful, or when we come across the poor and victimized of this world, is that our material wealth is not transferable, while our spiritual wealth, gained by grace through faith, will go ahead of us into eternity. Paul's words here about Onesimus, he who was one of you, take on far more significance than we living in a first world country in the 21st century might imagine, for Paul here says a slave is the same as any other believer in Christ. In verses 10 and 13, Paul begins to go beyond community to communitas, that special bond that people who have experienced difficulty, suffering, or death alongside one another, perhaps most clearly understood by those who have fought on the battlefield or have otherwise risked their very lives alongside of and on behalf of one another. It should be significant to those who remember Paul's clash and departure from his mentor Barnabas in Acts 15 verses 37 to 40 here, that this is the same John Mark for whom Paul now asks welcome and care as a fellow laborer, even though Paul once felt abandoned by this young man a long time ago. I am also touched by how Paul speaks of Epaphras and of his labor in prayer and intercession, and how this labor in prayer and intercession makes him someone worthy of great honor and respect. Then in verses 14 and 18, Paul closes with mention of his dear friend and eventual biographer Luke, and of a woman who at least hosts, if not leads, a church in her house, Nympha, and how Paul encourages them to share the letters he wrote to respective churches in Colossae and Laodicea with each other. Paul also makes time and space for a personal word of encouragement to Archippus, of whom we know not much other than the locality of his ministry in Colossae. Yet his ministry was clearly significant in the sight of Christ and of Paul. While Bible historians tell us that this was not Paul's last letter, this was a letter written in difficult times for Paul, as he was already in chains because of his ministry and witness for Christ. And so we find that even in difficulty and with pressing needs of ministry around him, Paul saw human relationships as being of great value, here on earth as well as in heaven. While you're probably not in prison for the sake of Christ as you watch this video, I want to ask you, do you value the people God has placed in your life as Paul valued the people God had placed in his life? With all who are in Christ, we share a present love and ministry, as well as an eternal hope and future that should lead to faith, love, hope, and unity here, and an eternity of love, joy, peace, and fellowship with Christ and those who love him forever.